All right, today we're going to talk about cameras, camera bodies and lenses and stuff. If you're an old-time photographer, this probably is not going to be anything new to you. If you're fairly new or you got into it and you still have some questions and you kind of feel bad about asking them because it's like these are simple questions and you shouldn't have to be asking them. And so far, basically there's no such thing as a silly question. I saw a story once where a guy had been shooting for 2 years very successfully and doing a good job. And then one day his assistant had to help him figure out that there was a meter built into his camera. And he didn't know that for 2 years. So, hey, it happens to everybody. I find buttons all the time. It's like, I wonder what that does. And it's like, oh my God, really? So, anyway, let's talk about camera bodies to start with. When people say that any camera will work, they're right, any camera works. I've taken some of my pictures with an iPhone and it works just fine. Doesn't work as well in the studio because of course you use flashes there usually, and there's no way to trigger those. But for outside stuff, it's all about light. If you understand light, even an iPhone does the job just fine. So keep that in mind. Don't say, oh, my camera's not good enough. Don't use that as an excuse because it isn't. It's not a good one at all. Now I use Canon. There's nothing special about Canon. I tell people my favorite camera is the right-handed black one. Okay, that pretty much covers them all, right? So I use Canon. I know Canon. It fits my hand well. Nikon seems to be a little small for me, but I'm not saying one's better than another. All of them are fine. It's what you do with them, and that's the important part. Okay, there's two kinds of cameras. There's something called a crop sensor and full frame. Okay, full frame is going to give you your 8x10 kind of pictures. Generally, wedding kind of stuff is why you're expected to have full frame in weddings. Although a crop sensor one can be, cropped to be 8x10 just as easily. You just have to remember that when you're taking the pictures. There's not that much difference. A crop sensor is more the size of today's, or not size, the shape of TVs today, 9x16 I think it is. So they're thinner and longer, and that's the pictures. I actually prefer them. I like that look because I do a lot of negative space stuff, and that gives me a lot of room for that. So full frame is going to give you, more old-fashioned TV size pictures, more square, and crop sensors wider. Now here's the gotcha though. If I put a 50 millimeter lens on this full frame, it's 50 millimeters. If this is a crop sensor body and I put a 50 millimeter in there, it's not going to be 50. It's going to be more like 80 something. Okay, so I have to remember that they show up differently. It's because it turns around and you're losing some of it on the top and bottom, and it doesn't add up to the same amount. Works just fine, nothing wrong with that, and you'll get used to what works and what doesn't as far as what distances where you are to get it. Because if you have a 50 in one camera and it's an 80 something in another, then you're going to have to stand at a different spot to get the same picture. So keep that in mind. They don't show up as the same numbers exactly, but they'll still work fine. Nothing wrong with that. Just remember, an 85 isn't an 85. It's 100 and something. And they're all going to be a little bit different in that respect. Now, speaking of lenses, there's a couple of different kinds. There's a kind called kit lenses, and then L lenses or professional lenses. Okay. Kit lenses are the ones that when you go to Best Buy or Costco or something to look at a camera, it says, oh, it comes with these lenses. Those are kit lenses. Okay, they're inexpensive. They work fine. Okay, but they don't go very low on the f-stop because basically the amount of glass that they're going to be looking through is smaller. If you take a kit lens, this is a 2470. Okay, a kit lens of the same thing will be 2/3 this size around, and of course it's going to be much smaller in the front. So it can't take in as much light, and since it can't take in as much light, then the f-stop won't go down as far. Usually it's about 4.5, somewhere in there. Now this is a professional one, and it goes all the way down to 2.8. And we'll talk about the primes later, which goes down a lot further because they have less glass they go through, and sometimes have even bigger openings in the front. But so there's the difference between those lenses. If you're going to do weddings and things like that, and it starts getting dark, you're going to lose a lot of your light with the kit lenses, where these will still work just fine, the professionals. The difference is a kit lens. This is a 24-70. I think a kit lens for this is probably $150 or $200. This was $1,800. Okay, but it's worth the difference. If you're doing it professionally, you need that light. You need to get that shot. You got to have the gear to do it in that case. Believe it or not, a cell phone will still work, but you can't blow up those pictures and get really good quality out of it. So I mean, there's still lots and lots of reasons to have a good camera. But even a beginner camera with a decent lens, it's still going to work the same way. It's just not going to work as well when it starts getting dark. Okay, so speaking of lenses, still continuing with lenses. This one's a 24-70. That means I can adjust it. It's a zoom lens, and it'll adjust from 24 millimeters to 70. So I've got this range that I can zoom in and out and capture. So I can be lazy, and I can sit here and I can zoom in and zoom out and take my pictures without doing a lot of moving around, which is kind of, it's nice. It depends on where you're at, what you're doing. Other lenses. This right here is called a 70 to 200, and you can imagine it costs more because it's bigger, right? And it's around $2,000, something like that. There are kit lenses that go 70 or 100 to 300, and they're considerably cheaper. They can be less than $500, and they still do the job fine. But again, they can't handle much lower light because they're going to have the much smaller aperture to bring the light in through. So that's really a big difference between them right there. They also can't take the wear and tear of these, but hopefully you're not wearing them and tearing them anyway. These are heavier, and usually these are made out of metal, and the kit lenses are usually made out of plastic. So that tells you a difference there. But again, depends on what it is you're trying to do. If you're out just shooting birds and butterflies and having a good time, kit lenses are fine. But as you grow in your photography, you're going to want better lenses. Lenses are more important than the camera body, big time. Now those, I've got one other one here. This is called a wide angle lens. This is a 1635 lens. I'll add some pictures of this that show you that I can do some amazing stuff. I've put this on a camera before, had a model laying on a bed, and I'll just reach over the model and click take the picture, and I get the entire bed. I get everything. It does a little bit of fisheye, but I can adjust that in post-production. But I took a picture from a sailboat, and I just held it over the woman in the front, in the bow, and she's in a bikini laying there, and I reach over, take the picture, and I've got everything. I've got the point on the boat. I've got the water on both sides. I also got my feet. I had photoshopped those out, but I look like I'm 20 feet up on the mast. So this is really nice. If you do weddings, the 1635 is important because you always need to get that close-up picture of the rings and the bushes or wherever it is you put them, and then the close-ups of the shoes, wedding shoes and all. So it's good for that kind of stuff too. But you can do some pretty fancy stuff with the 1635. You get very artistic with it. Now, one lens you should always have, always. It's like the lens. It's called a 50 millimeter or a nifty 50. Now it's not really 50 on a crop sensor, remember, but that's okay. It'll be more than that. It'll probably be close to 80 something. But it's a fixed lens anyway. So it just you can't zoom in and out. It's 50. That's it. It's not like 24-70. No. This is 50. And you put it on, and that's all it is. And in the old days, they had 35 millimeter lenses with the film cameras, and that's all they had. They didn't zoom in and out most of the time. They want to zoom in, they walk in. The nifty 50 is cool because it's very light, it's very cheap. This one right here is a better quality. It's one of the professional ones, and I don't think it was more than $400. And it still goes way down in f-stop, which means, I mean, you can have your And there's still a lot of opening there. Your aperture, I can go down to, I think, 1.4 on this one. It's either 1.4 or 1.8, which means in other places where you're using the kit lens, it can get too dark where it doesn't work. This one will still work. Okay, but again, it's fixed lens. And one of the reasons why it does so much better, because it's not that much bigger in the front as far as the aperture being able to get light, it has fewer pieces of glass to go through. There's a piece of glass in the back, there's one in the front, there might be one in the middle to mess with focusing or something. With a zoom lens, there could be 12 pieces of glass in there that do an accordion thing when it's, when you're zooming in and out, and that's why it's so heavy. And every time light goes through a piece of glass, it loses power, it loses its strength. It gets dimmer and dimmer as it gets to the bottom. So when you've got a zoom lens, you're going to have a lower f-stop. Like the lowest they can go is like 2.8, because, well, it's going to lose so much through all of that glass. You use a prime lens that has fewer pieces of glass in it, and you're going to get more light out the back. So then you can get down into pretty close to 1 point something on your f-stop. That gives you the beautiful bokeh in the background and all of that, especially at night. So to do artistic things, you're going to want to do some stuff at the lower f-stop. If all you're doing is fashion, you're going to be at f16 anyway, or f11, and it won't matter. You'd probably want something with a zoom because you're going to have it's lit up for fashion anyway. So this is probably the next prime you would want. If you've got the 50 and you've got enough money to spare, get an 85. Especially if you have a full frame, because 85 is just a good distance to do portrait work. So if you're going to do a lot of headshots and things, you should be doing with either a 50 or an 85. You don't have to be zooming in and zooming out if you're doing headshots in a studio anyway. So there you have a lot more control. With one of these, I can go down to f1.2. Now with something like that, and I'll have some examples on here, if I was at an angle like this and I was having a picture taken of me, and there's, I focus on this eye, you always focus on the eyes, this eye would be out of focus, because at f1.2 the depth of field that's in focus is very, very narrow, very tight, and that makes everything softer in front and behind, and that works really well. I mean, ladies love it because it makes everything soft and mysterious. Doesn't work well on grandpas like me. It's like, no, I got to see all the wrinkles, then he's who he's supposed to be. So keep in mind who you're shooting with it, but and how you're shooting. But I love my 85. It also makes me think more. If I can sit back and zoom in and out on something, it's like, I don't have to think so much about what I'm taking pictures of. With this, if I'm going to zoom in, I have to walk over and do it. Because I'm going to put the extra effort into it, I'm going to think it through more. So you're going to find a lot of times people say, yeah, doing it with a prime lens, that's the professional way to do it. That's the artistic way. Everybody has an opinion. And I'm sure they're not unbiased opinions, because, that's an oxymoron. Anyway, so that's the lenses. And I don't have anything else to show lens-wise, but let's talk about the camera itself, the camera body. There are 3 settings. I've got buttons all the way around this body. There's only 3 settings, okay, that you ever think about, have to worry about. You've got your, let's talk about the least important one first, ISO. Okay, in the old film days, you bought the film based on whether you're going to use it outside or inside. Is it going to be bright out or is it going to be dark? And you would buy the ISO, it was either 100 or 400. And I think they had some that were higher too, for places that were even darker. But 100 is for inside. And when you're shooting inside or in a studio, 100 is usually where you want to have it, most of the time. If it starts getting darker, you want to increase your ISO, because that increases the sensitivity of the camera. Just like the old film, it was more sensitive if the ISO was higher, or the ISO rating. I think they called it something different than ISO, but it was rated that so if you took the same picture, it would respond quicker to less light, and that's what ISO does here. 100 is pretty normal. 400 400 is going to make it more sensitive, so if it gets darker, I think I said it backwards earlier, you get higher in your ISO, makes this more sensitive. So if it gets darker, you can up your ISO, and it makes it so the camera's more sensitive to that light. But you have a cost there. When you get past a certain point, and different cameras are different, they're getting better and better all the time. But if you get over 1,000 or 2,000 on your ISO, pictures are going to start looking grainy. It's just natural. It's just the way it is. Sometimes they can get really grainy if you go way up there. I mean, ISO can go up to like 32,000. There's a setting in most of the cameras that say don't ever let the camera go in automatic ISO. Don't ever let it go over half, because anything over that, the pictures are just terrible. So they'll say our camera will go to ISO 64,000, but you'd never want to go over 32,000. So it's kind of like your car can go 120 miles an hour, and it can, but not for very long. That's why it says 120, but you're cruising along at 60 most of the time. So anyway, there's the ISO, and that's if you're doing a wedding or you're outside and it's getting dark, you can crank up the ISO a little bit, or if you're shooting in a dark warehouse, wherever you need more light, you can turn up the ISO, but it's a last resort thing. You want to use those other two things first. And what you've got there is shutter speed, and that's how fast it clicks and allows light in. Like if the shutter speed was set for 1 second, it would open up the shutter for 1 second, and then it would close it. And that's letting in light for that whole second that it's coming through. By the way, you'll never take a picture like that unless you're doing it of the sky, most likely. Stars at night. So that's shutter speed. Okay, and that's generally in hundredths of a second is what you're going to measure that in. We'll talk about that in combination with aperture. The aperture is it's a thing in the front that opens and closes and lets a certain amount of light in through the lens. You can even see it on some lenses. You look at it and you change the aperture on it, and it changes how big the hole is that the light comes in through. So think about it. We can make the aperture really tiny, really small, or we can open it up to full opening. If I'm using my 85 millimeter here, I told you the professional lenses have a big opening in it. I mean, look at that. That's huge. Compared to my fingers here, you can see there's a lot of opening there. This is why this one can actually open up all the way. If I open it up all the way, I'm at f1.2, which means it's pretty much bringing in as much light as it possibly could. There's no closure at all. And when you do that...
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not sure I needed you to tell me that. Okay. Or was that one of you saying that? With the aperture wide open like that, that's when you get the really tight focus. The depth of field is very, very tight. If I was using that here, all of the stuff behind me would just be blurry. And it's beautiful at night, and it's good for a lot of artistic-y kind of things, wedding type things, whatever. But here's the deal. When you open it up like that, you have that lack of focus range. You only have a very tight area to focus. Now, if I run the same lens up to f16, okay, it'll see everything perfectly, just fine. And it will have closed, f16 will be a little tiny circle that it's receiving or getting light in. It's a very small spot. And you get up to f22, and it's a tiny, tiny spot. So, it's a tiny opening, I should say. And here's a way to remember that. You probably did this when you're in grade school. Probably you take two pieces of paper, you make a little tiny pinhole in the top paper, and you hold it out in the sun, and you focus the bottom one, and you can actually see the sun, and you can see sunspots and everything in great detail on the sun. Okay, that's because every ray of light that's coming through that little tiny hole is hitting a little tiny spot on that lower piece of paper. Okay, so every spot on that paper is only seeing one tiny piece of the sun there, its own little piece. Now, if you turn around and make that hole bigger, okay, or open up the aperture, you're going to get a blurry white spot on the paper below, because so much of the sun is coming through and hitting so much of the area there. So that's the way I remember, you know, which f-stop is what. If it's very low f-stop, it's wide open, and it's going to have a lot of blurry stuff in it, because the depth of field then goes really, really tight. You go really high f-stop, f22, little tiny hole, and everything is clear. If you're taking pictures of the Grand Canyon, you certainly want to use a high f-stop, because you don't want anything to be blurred. There's your difference there. So that controls how much light comes in a sense. The other control you have is the shutter speed, how long it opens up to get that light. Okay, so if you're opening up that shutter for 1/200th of a second and you've got your aperture at a certain thing, it's going to get X amount of light, right? Now, if you change your aperture and then change your shutter speed, you can get exactly the same amount of light, but you're going to get a little different view of that light, because it's focusing it differently. The depth of field has changed and all of that. They work together, so you can actually get a great picture with different f-stops and different shutter speeds, and it'll be the same picture, except it's going to be different as far as how much the background is going to be in focus and that kind of thing. Now, also when you go wide open with the f-stop, you go down, sure enough, you lose a lot of the focus, which it sounds like it's a bad thing, but it's not. It's very artistic. It's beautiful. Backgrounds that are forests turn into just big green backgrounds. Beautiful. Anyway, if you open it up, you can shoot longer, because when the sun goes down, you open that up and you're going to get more light, and at the same aperture, or at the same shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 1/200th of a second and everything's going fine, it starts getting darker. You can lower the shutter speed a little bit, or you can up that ISO if you want, but remember, it's going to get grainy if you get too high with it. But you can open up the aperture, and more light comes through in that 1/200th of a second, because you've made the opening bigger. Okay, you get to a certain point, and now you're fully open. You don't really want to do that, because it's really hard to focus on a little spot, you know, that narrow depth of field at too low of an f-stop. You probably wouldn't want to go less than 5 or 6, you know, if you're doing groups, or, you know, people out in a field or whatever. The key is to go out and play with your lenses and find out how they react and what you can do with them. Definitely and absolutely. Don't buy a lens and then go do a paid shoot, and expect everything to be good. You need to play with that lens and everything about it. The other thing is the speed. You can change the speed all you want to adjust. You know, remember, the two kind of work together. The aperture is you're adjusting how artistic it's going to look, and the speed is going to make up for what you did with the aperture most of the time. It's like, you open this up, you're going to make this shorter, because you need the same amount of light to go in. So those two work together, and it's interesting that the shutter, it's not a thing that just opens and closes like that. It's actually called a curtain. It's a opening like this, and it actually goes down like that and gets the picture. Because if you think about it, something that goes like this and then closes, this would get so much more exposure than that did, because it's opening and closing. So keep in mind, the shutter is actually a curtain, or a little slot that goes from the top to the bottom, and that way it all gets exposed evenly. So when you hear the word curtain, that's what they're talking about. It's the shutter itself. So it's kind of a little tidbit. You don't have to know that to work it. But the combination of those work together well. On the shutter speed, you probably won't want to go under 1/80th of a second. If you've got things that are moving fast, 1/80th of a second, you're going to get blur, because it's open too long while it's taking the picture, and you don't want that. Well, unless you want it artistically. Sometimes that's kind of cool. like if you're looking at cars going by at night or something, you might want to open it way up and get some taillight streaks or some headlight streaks. That would be at low aperture or low shutter speed. You know, 1/25th of a second is, if a car's going by at 30 miles an hour, you're going to get these beautiful little streaks and things. So play with it. So here's the deal. I've told you now about the 3 things that you can set on your camera, and I've told you about some different lenses. And there's kit lenses, and there's the more expensive professional lenses, which, you know, actually have more range in aperture in most cases, is what the big difference is. That extra glass is what costs the money. It's not just because it says professional on it. So the one thing you need to do, what I did when I first got mine, is I went to a park and I sat down on a park bench and I put my lenses, I think I had 3 at the time, in front of me, and I would use each lens. I'd play around with the lens until I got to know how it reacted, what kind of pictures I was getting from that lens. Here's where it's nice to not be on film, because you can see right away what you're getting. I would shoot birds and trees and shoot into the sun, shoot away from the sun. I would shoot everywhere. I didn't even know how to set my camera right. So I'd put it on automatic, I'd point it, look and see what the settings were, and then I'd go to manual and I'd set those. And the camera was usually way off from what I would normally want to use. But that told me what the camera thought it should be, and it gave me a starting point. And then I would play with the f-stop, play with the aperture, or I'd play with the speed, and I'd play with the 2 of them and see how they reacted. You know, I'd spend hours out there shooting cars going by and people on the sidewalk and whatever it was. I needed to know how those lenses reacted and how they worked. And you need to get that to a point where you're not thinking about the gear. You're thinking about where you're going to put the person, you know, where's the light the best and all of that. You have to have the confidence that that's going to work exactly the same each time. And you get to know that. When you put that camera in your hand, you know what to do. You know if you use this lens and you use these settings, that's what you're going to get in this light. That's the important part, and that's the first part of building your style, is knowing how your gear works. You don't have to know it in super detail. It's kind of like, I don't suspect race car drivers have to know how a piston engine works. They do, but they have to know how to drive that car. So don't worry about, there's a ton of things on the camera that you don't need to know about. Those 3 things are the important thing on the body, and then the different kinds of lenses, the zoom lenses and the prime lenses. And the primes are kind of cheap. If you want to start with something that can go into a low aperture like f1.4 or 1.8, do a nifty 50. I mean, I actually bought one online for $50. I'm pretty sure the lens was plastic, but it worked. It let me see what a 50 millimeter will do. It's not what I use now, by the way, but it exposed me to that. Or go rent some lenses, or go to a show. A lot of times you go to a photography show, and they'll take your driver's license, and you can take a lens out and you can shoot around the show a little bit and get a good feel for it. So do that. Play. Shoot all you can. It doesn't, you know, especially since we're not wasting film, we're good. So I hope that helped. It gives you an idea of the different kinds of lenses that you've got available. Those aren't the only ones, by the way. They're the hundreds of different combinations, especially in zoom lenses. But prime lenses, 50, 35, 85, there's a bunch of different standards out there. 50 and 85 are probably the biggest ones. So anyway, if you have any questions, make sure you message me. I'll be happy to answer them. There's probably a million other videos out there that talk about this, and probably do it slower than I did, because, you know, I like to talk fast. You can pause it, you can back it up, you can listen again, and it's better than waiting for me to get to the point. Anyway, enjoy and shoot up a storm and work on that unique style. We all have one. Some of us just haven't found it yet. If you found it, great. If you haven't, you will.